Hello everybody, I hope you are fine. This is novel grade 4. Last lecture we have taken an introduction into Victorian and modern novels. Then in the actual lecture we have studied The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. This lecture we are going to start our study of White Sargasso Sea by Jane Rees. Jane Rees is a Caribbean novelist who was born in 1890 and died in 1979. Her father was a doctor and her mother had a Scotch origin, so that by their immigration and living in the Caribbean islands, they were referred to as being Creoles, meaning they are not Caribbean natives. Rees received her early education in Dominica, one of the towns or places of the Caribbean islands. However, at the age of 16, she had a desire to continue her education in England, so that at the age of 16, she traveled to England and stayed with her aunt and joined the school at this time. However, her experience at the school was not successful. Other students do not accept her and mocked her as being an outsider because of her strange English accent, which denotes her strangeness and her being not native citizens. After this bitter experience at school, she joined the 2 terms in studying drama or the art of theater at the Royal Academy. This is Jane Rees. Starting her literary career was initiated in 1924. The motive behind starting this career came after her meeting the writer Ford Madox Ford. Actually, there was a kind of relationship between these 2 people, Jane Rees and Ford Madox. This encouraged her to start her writing career. Of course, she attempted to work in other jobs, but maybe she was not very much successful. Her first novel was Voyage in the Dark in 1934, which caused her much popularity. Then she wrote White Sargasso Sea, which is a universal text which is famous all over the world. The reasons of this success and the popularity returns to the fact that White Sargasso Sea is a writing back text. What do we mean by writing back? We mean that the writer in this text is answering back another writer who wrote against his identity, culture, religion, or country. As we know from our study of Jane Eyre in the 3rd grade, that Charlotte Bronte, the Victorian novelist, wrote her text Jane Eyre. The protagonist was Jane Eyre, who desired to marry the male protagonist, Mr. Edward Rochester, the English gentleman. However, their marriage was not completed at the beginning due to the existence of a first wife, Bertha Mason. Bertha Mason was negatively represented in Charlotte Bronte's text. She was presented as being the mad woman in the attic, the black woman who came into England in order to destroy the happiness and ruin the life of Mr. Edward Rochester, the English young man. She was representative of the third world, whose interference and coming into the British society will destroy its happiness and national security. Jane Eyre, being a Caribbean writer, was very much dismayed of this representation and decided to answer back in order to defend her country throughout the negative representation of Bertha Mason. She decided to write a kind of prequel to Jane Eyre, meaning to represent the incidents or the events preceding Jane Eyre. That's why she decided to write White Sargasso Sea. This time, Jane Eyre presented as her protagonist Antoinette Causeway, a Caribbean woman, and the first wife of Mr. Edward Rochester. This time, the protagonist is the narrator who narrates her life before and during meeting Edward Rochester. Jane Eyre wants to expose to the whole world the encounter between English people and the Caribbean people. She wanted to expose to the whole world the influence of colonization on the Caribbean people and their mental psychology. Jane Eyre wanted to express to the whole people that the mental disturbance caused to her own, is the result of her relationship with this exploiting and manipulating English man who came to the Caribbean to take the riches of those people, and then he was responsible of destroying them. The setting of the novel was in Jamaica, one of the towns in the Caribbean islands. The incidents in the first part of the novel were affected and reflected the Slavery Abolition Act, which was issued in 1833. The Slavery Abolition Act was issued in Britain and was applicable to all the British colonies except 3 regions. But the Caribbean islands was one of the regions or the colonies in which this law was applicable. According to this law, the ownership and the purchase of slaves was abolished and forbidden. That's why many businessmen whose fortune was constituted from owning slaves were destroyed as a result of this law. The British government promised those businessmen to compensate them. However, there was no compensation, and the life of those businessmen was actually destroyed. This is the first political incident which affected the incidents of the story and which shows the influence of the British colonialism on creating disturbance and a kind of civil unrest in the Caribbean society. Where are the Caribbean islands? The Caribbean is a region of North America which consists of the Caribbean Sea and the islands accompanying or surrounding it with their coasts. And this is a map of the Caribbean Sea and islands. The Sargasso Sea is the sea which distinguishes the Caribbean islands. It's a distinct kind of sea because it has no shores. Instead, it's surrounded by water from all sides, particularly water gears. It's a part of the Atlantic Ocean and was surrounded by the currents of the ocean gears. The name Sargasso comes from sargassum, which is harmful seaweed with the color brown, and which distinguish this sea with its blue water. Actually, the Portuguese sailors or explorers in the 15th century were the early ones who called the sea by that name in reference to the brown seaweeds that distinguish that sea. The novel consists of 3 parts. Part 1 is narrated by the young protagonist, Antoinette Causeway. She was still a child. She suffered very bitter childhood experience because her father, the very rich man, Mr. Causeway, suddenly lost all his fortune because his fortune was embodied in owning so many Caribbean slaves. After the passage of the law of slavery abolition in 1833, Mr. Causeway, who is a representative of many businessmen, lost this fortune. The slaves left him immediately after their being free by law, so that his gardens, his lands, had no people to farm and to guard and to take care of. Even the slaves inside his palace left him, and he was bewildered. He entered into a state of despair. That's why he was immersed in drinking alcohol till his death as a result of his sadness for the loss of his fortune. Of course, he waited for the British government compensation for his lost fortune, but there was no compensation. This affected his family negatively. His wife, Aunt Annette, and his two children, Antoinette and Peter, suffered very much. That's why after his death, Annette was forced to accept the marriage proposal of an English rich man by the name of Mr. Mason in order to keep the same level in which she used to live in. Mr. Mason was very rich and civilized man. However, Annette, the mother, always complains to her husband that she suffers from the mockery of the townspeople who try to say to her bad words whenever they encounter this woman on her way. They consider Annette their oppressor and they want to revenge upon her for her treatment to them during their slavery. That's why they always make problems to her. Annette asks her husband to leave this country into England, but her husband, who comes to seek his fortune in the Caribbean, refused her proposal or suggestion and expresses uncaring of those people. Unfortunately, one day the ex-slaves came by fires and surround the palace in which Annette and her husband and the children live. They set fire into this palace and the young boy who was mentally disabled died as a result. It was a very horrible experience for Antoinette, the protagonist, as a child to see her young brother dying of burning. This caused mental disturbance for the mother, Annette, who started to make problems and crying hysterically in the face of her husband because she saw him as responsible for this problem and for the death of her child. That's why Annette, the mother, became mentally disabled, or she lost her mental sanity from the moment of the death of her young child. That's why Mr. Mason, who was forced to leave the Caribbean into England, left Annette, his mentally disabled wife, with a couple. This British couple ill-treated Annette and she suffered a lot with them. Antoinette, the young child, was left with her aunt in order to be brought up away from her mentally disturbed mother, so that Antoinette was separated from her mother many years before the death of this mother. This left Antoinette with an experience of isolation and very hard feelings. After the illness of her aunt, Antoinette was moved to a boarding school for girls, where she spent her teens years. During these years, she occasionally had visits from her father-in-law, who offered her so many gifts. Mr. Mason, before his death, left Antoinette part of his fortune. This made people realize or know that Antoinette is an heiress, meaning she becomes a rich woman. At the age of 18, her brother-in-law came to announce to her that there was an English suitor who wants to meet her. That's why Antoinette left the school at this stage in order to start her mature life in another place. This is the end of stage 1 in the life of Antoinette. This part is narrated by Antoinette as a child. That's why while reading this part, we expect to find the point of view of a young child, narrating and telling the reader of her bitter childhood experience and suffering. That's why she had high expectations of the English suitor who came to her. She believed and suggested that he is her savior, who will come to rescue her from her previous misery, and the one who will offer her happiness. In the next stage, or the second stage of the novel, we will see and focus on the marital life between Antoinette and this English suitor. We will see the marriage between a Caribbean woman and an English young man. We will see the influence of the encounter, the cultural encounter between a British man and one of the citizens or the inhabitants of the British colonies. We will see the influence of Britain or the British Empire on the citizens of the colonies. We will see how far this influence is positive or negative, how far the Englishman is responsible for the change that comes to Antoinette's life. Actually, this story merges or mixes the personal and the political. The relationship or the marital relationship between Antoinette and her husband is a representative or a depiction of the relationship between Britain and one of its colonies, the Caribbean islands. So the personal is a representative of the political. Again, I'd like to remind you that this text is written as a writing back or answer back or resistance literature in answer to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which glorifies the British Empire and depicts in a negative manner the colonies, the British colonies, meaning all the places or regions which submit or succumbed to the British occupation. Jane Rees, being a Caribbean writer, answered this depiction by Charlotte Bronte by writing a prequel or preceding incidents to the story of Jane Eyre, depicting the life of Mr. Edward Rochester with his first wife, the Caribbean woman. She wanted to show the British readers and readers all over the world the result of the encounter between a British citizen and a Caribbean citizen in order to see and realize the influence of this encounter on both the psychology of those people. She exposes the economic exploitation and the manipulation of the British to the colonists, which is followed by negative representation of those people. All this we will meet through our reading of the text. This is the end of part 1. Next time, inshallah, we will take part 2 with more details about the point of view, the protagonist, the themes, and other elements of the text. Thank you for your patience for me for today, and goodbye.